and John Barth, and we're professors at Arizona State University. And we thought we'd put together a podcast explaining what it's like to teach at what right now is the largest state university, I should say research university in the United States. I think with our online students, we're at like 110,000. Is that right?
Yeah, it's massive.
Yeah. Now, I think we'll probably talk about it because someone could say, look, that doesn't get to the quality at all. You could be large, but not have good quality. I actually think ASU has done very well for itself in quality also. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's measured in different ways. For example, number of Nobel Prize winning professors, usually especially is measured by the amount of grant money you get and spend. And I think without a medical school, we're also towards the top of that for state schools that don't have medical schools. And then we also do pretty well for ourselves because we're in a state that's a low taxation state. Arizona doesn't have a lot of taxes. And we also don't have oil money like Texas. So the fact that we're in Arizona doing quite well for ourselves also speaks highly of ASU. But that's just to say, look, here we are, two Reformed Christians in a secular university. And I've had people ask me, how do you do it? Like, it's kind of an odd thing, almost like you're seeing some creature you've never seen before at the zoo, and you didn't really know there were any of those. How does that thing survive? Where did it come from? So that's part of what we want to talk about. In our first episode, we talked a little bit about what it means to be Reformed. So in this episode, we're going to talk about a little bit about our research. And for me, I teach philosophy and religious studies. So those questions in those fields are what really attracted me to the Reformed faith in the first place. I wanted to know, as a high school student, I came into contact with other high school students from various world religions. And I realized they believe their religion for the same reason I believe my religion, which is that our parents told us it's true. And none of us really had any other reason to think it's true. And so for me, that was a challenge to say, I need to figure out what really is the case. What's the truth of the matter? And it boiled down to, especially, does God exist? Because I saw that the different religious, my friends in different religions had different answers about that. Even if they all said there's God, what they meant by God was vastly different. So for me, it came down to that. And then coupled with being challenged, realizing I don't know, but I should know. If God exists and God's revealed himself, then I should know that, and I don't. And that's really where sin begins. And not knowing what you should know about God and why you need Christ. So for me, those research questions all revolved around that same process or journey of trying to figure out, how can we know God if God is real at all? So it's both a knowledge question, how can we know, and a reality question, what's real? Is God real or not? So I've put out books on one's titled The Clarity of God's Existence. And I look there, not just that God exists, and not just that there's an unmoved mover or an uncaused cause, but that God exists, and I'll define God. God's a spirit who's infinite, eternal, and unchanging in being, wisdom, power, holiness, goodness, justice, and truth. So that's quite a definition. Those things are all true about God, and you can know them. You should know that.
Right.
So that's where I look at in my research as I study both the world's religions, but also natural theology. I gave myself, I don't know, you can tell me, is this okay? I gave myself an unofficial title. I call myself the unofficial ASU chair of natural theology.
I like it.
I don't think anyone else is competing with me for that. So far, no one has said, stop saying that.
That's very good.
But tell us about yours now.
Yeah. So Owen and I do very different work. I'm in the history department, and I study early American history, colonial primarily, although the second book that I'm working on right now deals with the American Revolution. But I'm mostly interested in political history and also monetary history, economic history more broadly, but I focus in on money, on currency. After the 2008 financial crisis, I was in the MA program at the time at UNC Charlotte. I became deeply interested in central banking. Where does our money come from? And from there, in researching the Federal Reserve and reading the works of Austrian economists, who I won't define necessarily what that is, but if you understand what that is, you know what I mean. And from studying banking theory, I became interested in currency theory. I became interested in, oh, what did it look like in the past? And I was already a history major, and so it was natural to want to look into the past. And long story short, I wrote my dissertation on the history of money in colonial America, published that book, got my dissertation in 2014 from George Mason University, and it was published into a book last year with Cornell.
We should have our books here to show to the screen. What we'll do is we'll put a link to our author pages so that in the audience you can follow up for our publications and books.
Yeah, and how many books have you published?
My last one was the Cambridge Companion to the First Amendment and Religious Liberty. I think that was number 8.
Mm-hmm. Wow. All right. So
that's basically our job, right? Is to publish things.
That's right. Publish or die. That's what they say. Mm-hmm. I've got some articles. But
articles.
Yeah, of course. But
we should sort of brag. You received tenure.
I did. I was just promoted to associate professor, so that was based on the publication of the book. So I'm not a professional theologian. To quote, I think I quoted R.C. Sproul in the last video. I'll do it again. Everyone's a theologian. Everyone has a theology. And whether you know it or not, you could be an atheist and you have a theology.
Yeah.
And so
you're presupposing something about reality and about knowledge.
That's right. And so my interest in theology takes place in a sphere outside of my historical writing. But I know as I read and write history that God is always there. I mean, God is always present, and the providence of God. The founding fathers talked a lot about this, about Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, John Adams were big believers in the providence of God. They understood that God works in history. God does not just stand off on the sideline viewing everything.
The providential rule of God. Yeah.
That's right. And so history
that's part of the Aristotelian. We talked in our last podcast a little bit about Aristotle and the idea that he's the uncaused cause, the first mover. But Aristotle's God is not providentially rule.
No. So history is a story of it's a story of man, yes, but it's also it's a larger story, and God is sovereign over history and is the author of history ultimately.
Well, and I think that for many Christians, there's kind of this strange thing that happens due to a limited soteriology, which is your view of salvation. And so the idea is that in order to go to heaven, you have to say certain words, like a sinner's prayer. And then when you die, you go to heaven. And in the meantime, you're kind of just maybe enjoying yourself and don't get into too much trouble. And so they don't see any connection between the work we have in this life and their highest blessing. This life is just kind of the in-between shown. I think C.S. Lewis called it the shadowlands while you're waiting for the next life. Whereas the Reformed tradition has said, no, our work, we're given work by God from the very beginning. We're to work in the world and to understand it and to name the creation. And that work brings glory to God. And so studying history, studying finance is part of that revelation of the glory of God. It's not just you're biding your time till you get to heaven.
Well, that's what also drove a lot of the scientists and during the scientific revolution, in the Enlightenment. A lot of people assume, Newton and Galileo, and they were if not atheists, they were irreligious. And it's actually not true. They believe that by studying nature and the laws of various scientific laws of nature, that they are studying the cosmos that God created, and that for them was
Yep.
was very meaningful.
Yeah. Right. That's right. And I think both Kepler and Newton said something along the lines of, I'm thinking God's thoughts after him. You're seeing how God laid out the creation. And the fact that we can do that is itself remarkable.
Right.
The fact that I have a mind and the world is laid out according to the logos, which reveals God, and my mind can also use that to understand the world and how it works. None of that would make any sense from a purely materialist standpoint. Collections of chemicals don't understand things.
So, Owen, why are you at ASU and not a seminary?
Yeah, that's a good question. Or a faith-based school teaching undergraduates. I partly for the reason I just said about general revelation. I think the word secular university could mean one of two things. It could mean anti-religious. And a lot of times that is unfortunately what it means. But it doesn't have to mean that. I don't think it even historically meant that. It could also mean just the study of the secular, the study of this world, of general revelation. And so that's a place where you get to dive into the revelation of God in creation and history. So for me, those are always the really interesting questions. How did God create? How do we know that? How has God ruled in history? So I think a secular university is the best place to get to do that. But then going back to the first definition about it being anti-religious, I'm also kind of enjoy the wrestling, I guess I'll call it, with other ideas. I don't want to be sequestered behind walls where everyone thinks the same way I do. I want to be where everyone's debating and all different ideas are coming together. And you got to know what you think, and you got to be willing to change your mind if you're wrong, but you got to be able to present arguments to the other person about what they think and why you think they're mistaken. I don't want to be away from that. And I've been, there's not to put down religious schools, but I've been to enough of them where that just doesn't happen. You only hear about opposing ideas from a professor who agrees with you.
I'm not sure the modern university, secular university, differs too much from that either.
I know, unfortunately, that's true. Yeah. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about that in a future podcast.
You gave sort of the classical description of a university, but yeah, it certainly. I mean, like we want to be in the arena, and that's not to put down the other schools. Those schools have a function and should exist and thrive, but we are where we are for a reason. I'm really glad we're at ASU and in a secular Research One university. And what you said about the word secular too is so important. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was Thomas Aquinas who spoke of that the distinction between the secular, the sacred and the secular. And so often, don't mean to go too much on a tangent, but when people talk about, for example, separation of church and state, you can actually trace that idea back to like Luther and this desire not to keep Christian morals or ideas or the Christian worldview out of these so-called secular institutions, but that there is a distinction between the church, the ecclesiastical authority on the one hand, and then the civil authority on the other, but that the Christian worldview is every bit as relevant and applicable in that civil kingdom, in that secular world. And actually, as Christians, we are called to not to some monastic life where we just only talk to ourselves and read.
What's a popular thing you've heard of, this Benedict option going around? This idea of the Benedict option is that we're entering the dark ages ahead of us. Civilization is dying, And so we have to be like the Benedictine monks, which for a few centuries just kind of preserved civilization
Mhm.
until it was ready to regrow in the Renaissance. And I don't think that's the right model at all. I don't think we need to
No.
sequester ourselves. If civilization's dying, I'm not saying it is, but
Mhm.
if it is,
Mhm.
it's because it's departed from the law of God and needs to be reminded of that, not
Right.
you abandon it and hide behind walls until you're ready to come out.
Well, the culture is obviously is unwell at the present moment, is sick, but that's all the more reason to engage because
Yeah.
and actually I would say the uh, the fields are ripe. There's
Yeah,
a harvest
exactly.
out
Yep.
there. What was that old hymn? Lord of harvest, send forth reapers.
Mhm.
And when we engage with our students, I think actually now more than probably quite a long time, I think that students um, are more receptive in, in a long time. I won't try to put a date to it, but the reason for that is that the world at present just offers so few answers,
Yeah,
and
it's just
and
meaningless.
and the students know that
It's
it's
almost like
meaningless.
Solomon said, vanity, vanity, meaningless, meaningless, all is meaningless. And
Yep.
culture said, hold my beer. I can make it more meaningless. Right.
Yeah, that's
I
right.
think it's real.
And that's all the more reason too. Like when we, so like in the classroom, I don't proselytize. I don't do that.
Yeah, of
That's
course
not
not.
my role. That's not what I was hired for.
Yep.
But students, they figure out one way or another that something is different, and I just teach good solid history in the classroom and try to do so in a personable way, and uh and but my um one of the goals that I have every semester is that students understand that I'm a man who fears God, and
Mm.
so it, and
That's a great phrase. I'm glad you used that because that's fallen out of usage. But people used to use that as a compliment. They would say, "Oh, John Barth, he fears God," and that would be a way of saying that's a good guy.
yeah,
And we don't use that anymore.
well, people don't like the whole concept of the fear of God anymore.
Yeah. Yep.
But I think that when we engage the culture, especially more like overt ways, like what we're doing right now, when we
Yep.
engage the culture, um, because the culture needs answers so badly, that's all the more reason to just boldly present truth. I mean, that's
Yeah.
what's effective.
Well,
These mainline churches that want to pad everything and package it all nicely and don't talk about the fear of God, don't talk about sin, don't talk about judgment. Yeah. Why? Well, we want to reach the world. The world's not going to be drawn to that. Why?
well,
If
not
I'm
only that,
in
but
the world,
they
why
won't be
would I
drawn
want
to
that?
knowing God. Yeah, exactly. They won't in the end come out to know God at all.
That's right.
That's more like, well, what do I need to do if there does turn out to be a judgment? How do I avoid coming on the bad end of it? But that's not motivated to know God. I mean, you wouldn't think about that. You say that to your Valentine, you say that to your wife. Hey, look, what can I get you on Valentine's Day so you don't get mad at me? Right? Like, I don't want to get yelled at. So what, you need some roses or something like that? No one would, that's not the love of your wife, right? If you loved God, you wouldn't have that approach to God either. Like, what's the minimum I can do to get by? You'd say, I can't wait to know as much as I can about God.
Right. So
Now, let me tell you one skill that I end up spending most of my time on as a philosopher is just this: being able to represent your opponents accurately. That's why if I had to say two things I spend my time in the classroom, that's the number one. And the second one is learning what it means to think. People how to even describe their opponents, and that's true politically for a Democrat or Republican. That's true for an atheist or Christian, any religion. We tend to describe the person we disagree with as being pretty stupid.
mhm.
So what I would want someone to be able to do, if they're a Christian, I would want them to be able to tell me what an atheist thinks, and it's the best explanation you can give from the smartest atheist out there. That's what I would, as a philosopher, want them to be able to do, not some weak version that's easy to argue against.
Mhm.
And people just don't have that skill. And then the second one was critical thinking. And for me, what that means is identifying your assumptions. People just don't even realize they have presuppositions and how to identify their own. They're pretty good at identifying the other guy's failures,
Mhm.
but they're almost never able to explain their own presuppositions. So
Yep.
neither one of those could be characterized as I say those things, you say, oh, that's what you do. You're a Christian, huh? No, those aren't necessarily Christian things to teach. Those are just standard philosophical topics.
Yep, that's right. And I mean, and naturally, like, the type of classes you teach are very different.
Yeah.
And that you get to explore. Now, I actually do teach a course, Foundations of Democracy, where we read Thucydides, Machiavelli, Thomas Hobbes, Rousseau, and the number one theme that comes up over and over again, and of course, none of those authors were religious or in a Christian sense.
Yeah.
The number one theme that comes up is human nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
At bottom is human nature radically and totally corrupt, or is human nature perfectible?
Mm-hmm.
And does human nature and of course,
and
Rousseau,
what is fundamental to it? Like, are we basically brute animals who satisfy our desires?
Mhm.
Or are we souls, rational souls that can try to find meaning?
Yep. And what's amazing to me is that secular philosophy arrives at a at a reformed conclusion on human nature. I mean, read Hobbes.
Sometimes, yeah, I think I would. This will be a fun podcast. You and I can do some intellectual history, because I would think there's like a line from Rousseau to Kant to Nietzsche to Foucault and critical theory.
Of course.
So I think it's Rousseau, and he had a very rosy view of human nature, especially when it's not corrupted by society. So someone might say, well, how can you put Nietzsche there, though? Because he's very pessimistic about human civilization. Yeah, that's what corrupts you. But we have to go back to our natural instincts, and that's what's good. And that's a lot of what we're seeing today, I think, in identity and how we understand our identity is going back to like your natural instincts as what you are and who you should identify as.
For Rousseau,
so that's just Rousseau.
For Rousseau, the problem of evil can be found in institutions, and that institutions corrupt. And you
Precisely,
see, Rousseau, I've described Rousseau as the intellectual grandfather of the left. His view of human nature informs, whether people know it or not, has informed that entire worldview. And you see it in Thomas Paine and the French Revolution, and then all the way up through the present day.
If you just change institutions, you'd change society.
That's right. But
I think actually, we even here at ASU, we had I heard a talk yesterday that said it's the university's duty to change society, which means the university can. There's two things to that. Is that even true? The university should do that. But before that is, can it? Right? Like saying the university's job is to suspend gravity. Well, it can't do that. So the university's job is to change society. Maybe it can't even do that. But that's a very Rousseauian and French Revolution, French Enlightenment view of university.
And then in the 20th century, you see it in communism, where Lenin and later Mao, they want to create the new man. It's because much to Lenin and the Bolsheviks' disappointment, the working class stubbornly did not want to go along with their communist ideals. So their conclusion was, oh well, something Marx before that said, religion is the opiate of the masses, and for Mao's the Cultural Revolution, we need to overturn all the different prevailing traditions and customs and social institutions, because that's what's obstructing human beings from reaching this new era, this new perfection. And that's it's all founded on a faulty view of human nature. When I said secular philosophy, I meant when you read like Thomas Hobbes, that humans in a state of nature, life is the famous quote, of course,
Yeah.
life is poor, nasty, brutish, and short. I mean, you read that and you're like, he's spot on that, you know. I mean, like, and Thucydides, you see this in his writings on the history of the Peloponnesian Wars, just over and over again. Human beings demonstrate this propensity toward wickedness, toward corruption, and you don't have to be a Christian to see that. It's self-evident.
Yeah, David Hume in his dialogues concerning natural religion has one of his characters say, the world is filled with misery and wickedness. And I was like, yeah, this seems about right.
Voltaire had a good understanding of that too. You know, Voltaire was very critical of Rousseau.
Yeah.
I believe Rousseau had an overly rosy view. Yeah. And he said just history is just, I can't remember the exact quote, it's great though. He said history is just a succession of one disaster after another. Yeah. And every now and then, like an oasis in a desert, you might find some spectacular achievement, but other than that, it's, you know.
Yeah. So I think you put your finger on something, which is that we'll call it the left. The intellectual history of the left believes that by changing humans' external circumstances, you can change their inner condition. Mm-hmm. And that connects up to what you and I think as Reformed Christians, which is that our inner condition is that we're born dead in our trespasses and sins. And no external institution is going to bring me back to life. I would have to be transformed from the inside first. Or to put it this way, this phrase has been misused, and it's sad. But when a leading theologian named Nicodemus asked Jesus what he must do to be saved, Jesus' answer was, you'd have to be born again. Now, don't think about that as the way it's misused. Think about that in the sense of, if you have to be born again, what that means is you're dead. Mm-hmm. And Nicodemus was confused. And he said, well, but I'm an old man. I'm alive now. I'm not dead. And that confuses other people too. Like, what does that mean? Well, you're born in that condition of needing a new heart. Mm-hmm. And all of these attempts, whether it's Stalin, right now for my Great Books reading group, we're reading through Solzhenitsyn's The First Circle. So I've got Stalin on my mind. So all of the Soviets, all of what Stalin did, none of that can transform the inner person. And thinking that we could try it here on a smaller scale and that will do something. No, you need to explain to me how you can take someone from being dead in their trespasses and sins to being alive. Mm-hmm. That's what will transform society.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And that's the power of Christ.
That's absolutely right. And on a civil kingdom level, when you're talking about how to make the world a more livable place while we're here, despite the misery, despite the inherent fallenness of man, that instead of finding fault necessarily in institutions, the institutions are to blame. Yeah. We need social institutions, and by that I speak broadly, also customs and so we need institutions to rein into passions of man, to check those natural passions, those natural lusts that cause us to want to murder, to steal, and onward. And that's it. I believe Thomas Sowell has a great book called A Conflict of Visions. Thomas Sowell, an atheist, I believe. I don't want to slander the man, but I believe he's an atheist.
I don't know, but I know he's written a number of helpful conservative economic books.
But he sees the question all about human nature, and the conservative understands that human beings are human beings, and human beings are going to act in a certain way. And what you need stable, orderly institutions that will then, through various incentives, check man, and you're never going to have utopia. Stated differently, utopia is not possible on this side of heaven. So,
well, and I think our audience will get used to shameless plugs as they're listening to us. So I'll say one of my first book with Cambridge was titled The Natural Moral Law, and that's what it was about. Is there a moral law not revealed in Scripture, like the Ten Commandments is revealed law? Is there a natural law that all humans can know that directs us to what is our highest good and organizes our life together? Mm-hmm. And so that's one of my interests of study is, how do we know that law, and who makes it? Does Stalin make the law? Does the tyrant make the law? Who makes law? Where does it come from? And I think that what I would argue is that you'd have to have theism to have that kind of law.
Right. Yep. A
So
lot more
good.
to
I
say
think
about that, but that's a
I
big
know. Well,
topic, Owen. So I think
that's foreshadowing. Yeah, that's
There we
foreshadowing
go,
some
yeah.
great conversations we'll
Right.
have. And if you're listening, that's the kind of thing we want to offer here on the Reform Devils, is discussing those kind of topics. And I'm hoping that as we get going, we're going to have a way for our audience to send in questions also, so we can begin to deal with any questions you have. Right now, the best way to do that would be simply to email either one of us at our ASU email, which is available on the internet. And we'll put that contact information in the description of the episodes also. So,
and leave
John,
it,
thank you.
or leave a comment below if you're
Yep.
watching on YouTube, or
Yep.
various ways to get in touch. Maybe even a live Q&A wouldn't be a bad idea.
I know.
Either,
Yeah. Well,
but we'll talk.
what's that
We'll
called
see.
on Reddit? Ask me an AMA. Ask me anything.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. There you go.
Great. But thanks for joining us.